have a difficult job here, which is we've already hit the low points, and we haven't even started with the economists yet. So the question is, what on earth do you do? And the answer is, I suppose you can try to be unlike those dismal political scientists and actually try and offer a little bit of upbeat analysis. So what I'm going to try to do is completely reverse directions and try and be a little bit upbeat. And what I want to talk about is what's going on in healthcare, and in particular, talk a little bit about an issue that's long preoccupied the center here, and quite honestly, most of the health care field, which is how do we understand what's happening with the cost of medical care. So let me start off with where most people are, which is, I think Howard actually showed this slide, and it was probably a little bit prettier than my slide because I stole it and he created it. But this is the outlook for the federal budget, and you can see the federal budget. This is a percent of GDP, so the federal budget dashed line is revenues, which are just assumed to be a constant share of the budget. The white spot down at the bottom is Social Security. You can see aging there. If you squint a little bit, you can see more people going on to Social Security. As a share of GDP, it's not a huge issue. Other non-interest spending, we don't know how to forecast, so we use the time-honored technique of assuming it'll stay the same as a share of GDP as it does now. And of course, the whale that ate the picture here is healthcare spending, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and the exchange subsidies. Or to put it another way, the U.S. government does not have a deficit problem, it has a healthcare problem. And so this is sort of driving interest in sort of dismantling various healthcare programs or doing whatever else to healthcare programs that we think we want to do. And the question I want to ask is sort of, is this wrong, actually? And is this too pessimistic? And so I want to sort of give you a case for why this may be too pessimistic. And I want to start off by saying a lot of the forecasts are based on the past history. That's how you do forecasts, is you look at the past and you wave your magic wand and you put down some equations so nobody knows what you're doing, and then you forecast the future. And the question is, what is the basis for what's going on there? So let me show you a little bit the basis for what's going on there. So this is, if you look in old Center for Health Administration Studies volumes, you will see things that sort of successfully move this line forward. This is the growth of real per capita medical spending, and it averages about 5 to 6 to 7% a year, with some ups and downs, but pretty stable. The growth of the economy is about 2% a year, so there's a gap in there. And that gap is the chart I showed you on the previous page. So this was going along. I will embarrass Sherry Gleed by telling her that she was involved in the Clinton healthcare plan, so was Judy Fader in the 1990s, and look what they brought you. They brought you relatively low increases in medical care costs, and we should give them some share of the credit for that. And that lasted for a good number of years. And then we saw this. And so that was actually a bunch of providers taking advantage of the demise of managed care to raise the costs of medical services. In Boston, we experienced quite a lot of that, as did most areas around the country. And then since about the early 2000s, we have seen that. And that is, in terms of real terms, that is obviously the lowest growth rate we can find. Of course, the economy has done very poorly, so it's sort of not quite the best experience. But nonetheless, if you actually look at this chart, what you would be tempted to say is not that the growth of medical spending is about 1.5 to 2% above the growth of the economy, which is what the implication that's drawn from this is based on the entire time period, but perhaps that there are really two eras here. One era where growth was really extremely rapid compared to the economy. That takes care of the first part up to the early to mid-1990s, and a second where, with one exception, actually the growth of medical costs has actually slowed down. And in particular, once you get rid of price increases, maybe it's slowed down even more. So I sort of want to understand this, and I want to try and think about what we would make about projections if we believe something like that, or can we understand what's going on behind these sorts of curves. So the first thing that you do when you look at this is you say, obviously, well, of course, there was a big recession. Okay, so let's figure out the impact of the recession. Healthcare is sensitive, spending on medical care is sensitive to the economy. Thankfully, it is not a highly cyclical industry. That is, spending doesn't plummet in recessions and it doesn't soar in expansions because people still have insurance and they still get sick. So that's good, but there still is some relationship between the economy and medical spending. So I've done a sort of calculation where I take out that part. I basically say, what would have happened if the economy hadn't fallen off a cliff at the end of 2008? And let's see, did it not show up here? this is what you get. So you get that the line would go up some, but nowhere near to its historical levels. Or to put it another way, about 1/3 of the impact of, about 1/3 of the slowing down of healthcare relative to the historical average seems to be a result of the recession. 1/3 is a fairly big number, but it's not all of it. The recession is a one-time event, we hope. That is, it comes and at some point it's fully gone, which means that the slowing down of medical cost increases associated with the recession would be, one suspects, one time. There's actually a bit of debate in the literature as to whether it would be even more than that because people would then catch up, sort of pick up the utilization that they deferred during the recession, but nobody has a very clear handle on that. But so nonetheless, that's about 1/3 or 40% or so of the total. And the question is, what else is going on? And is that other stuff important in a way that's going to continually recur, or is it something that's going to dissipate as well and we should expect to come back up? So I am going to give you a non-scientific look at the remaining 60%. Non-scientific in the sense that I can tell you it's important, but I'm not going to quantify each one the way I can quantify, I think I can quantify what's going on with the overall growth of the economy. And there are three things that I want to talk about in this order. One is the technological environment. So the most important thing we know about medical costs is that over time they increase because the technologies available to treat people increase. And the interesting thing about that is that the technologies available to treat people have been increasing at a less rapid rate than they historically were. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that. Second is I want to tell you a bit about consumer price sensitivity, and I'm going to raise a puzzle for the economists in the room, which is our way of thinking about this traditionally the right way or not, and so I will come to that. And then third, I'll talk a little bit about reading the tea leaves in terms of greater efficiency among providers and whether that's having any impact here. And then I want to come back and try and talk a bit about what this means. Okay, so technology. If you actually look at this picture, what you'd see are sort of different eras in terms of what's sort of going on. So in the 1980s, you saw a lot of diffusion of cardiac technologies, and so a lot of sort of insurance plans were kind of worried about that. In the 1990s, you saw enormous new medications, and so a lot of worry about that. Up through the 2000s, there was a lot of emphasis on imaging growth and MRIs and PET scans and all of that sort of stuff in the diffusion. So you see sort of wave after wave of those sorts of concerns. The somewhat interesting thing is that if you look at all of those different areas now, what you see are actually falling rates of use or constant rates of use or sort of the pipeline running dry. If you look at the past 12 drugs or so that have been forecast to be, huge blockbuster drugs, approximately none of them have turned out to be blockbuster drugs, which is roughly like the record of economists in predicting recessions. Although we may be slightly better than that, in that occasionally we hit one of them. So pharmaceutical companies are kind of laying off people, and drug prices for stock prices for pharma companies are down. And it's sort of, a sort of continual disappointment here. In other conferences they have about the FDA, they sort of start off by showing a picture which is trend in pharmaceutical R&D and trend in new drug approvals. And they treat it as a sort of bad thing. That is, we're not developing new drugs for people. In this case, I don't want to say whether it's good or bad. I just want to say that it's sort of an important part of what's going on, which is if you look at the components of spending that have grown historically very rapidly, they're actually not increasing particularly rapidly. The same is true of imaging, which was growing a lot, and imaging growth seems to have slowed down. In some cases, actual utilization is declining, although in most other cases, utilization is just relatively flat and doesn't seem to be substituting for other things. At least one explanation is there are only so many heads you can image, and once you've imaged all of them, that's all you can do. But they're probably, I'm sorry, you can do it again. But there are probably other things you can do as well. But then you even see things like, for example, I was told the other day at a meeting of the American Heart Association Fellows in Boston that MGH Hospital used to do 24,000 stent implants a year. And then they read the clinical trials showing that for lots of cases of stable coronary disease, the stent implant is no better than medical management, and so they're down to 10,000 stents a year. 10,000 is still a high number, but it's about 60% below where it was. I don't know if that generalizes at all. I don't know anything about it other than the basic facts, in some sense that the technological use is slowing down. So that's going to be a very important issue in the long run. Driver here. Now, we don't know, of course, what's on the horizon, but one thing that we do know, we can calculate, is that 17% of pharmaceutical drug spending will come off patent in the next 5 years. And that if you look at the pipeline, if you have companies that look at the pipeline, IMS looks at the pipeline, there's nothing there that they say this is obviously going to be a huge breakthrough drug. I remember a couple of years ago, IMS was interested in giving advice to CBO and to the actuaries at CMS about forecasting Medicare drugs. And so I got a little bit of conversations back and forth. IMS said, look, we think your estimates are way too high. CMS said, well, they are what they are, and so on and so forth. And so they didn't modify them. And in the past couple of years, they've been surprised by how low prescription drug cost growth has been, and they've lowered their forecast about future growth in sort of exactly the way that that was going on there.